Greetings and salutations. This video is the third in our series in which I, Joe Collins, relate to you some of my favorite stories from nearly 40 years in broadcasting. I want to say thank you to everyone who has left positive comments and sent all kinds of support my way for this series of videos. It really is validating, for lack of a better word, because to tell you the truth, I put off doing this for years because I thought people would not be interested. So thank you very much. And yes, there are many more videos to come. This video is about a very special radio station to me and a special radio station in general, WTAR. WTAR is Virginia's first radio station, and it signed on in September of 1923 when the Reliance Electric Company of Norfolk was granted a license to operate a broadcast station, and the call letters WTAR have been in continuous use for nearly 100 years as of the recording of this video. There is a little bit of controversy about whether WTAR is actually the first broadcast station in Virginia. Apparently there was another one on in the Norfolk area at that time that had the call letters WSN, but whether or not this was a commercial station or just a hobby station or exactly what it was, that's kind of in dispute. So WTAR is pretty safe with its title of being Virginia's first radio station. WTAR is also the first radio station that paid me any real money for being on the air. And I ended up working for the company that owned WTAR for just about 4 years. I started there in June of 1989, and there was a break where I left for a while, and I came back, and then I was there until October of 93. To understand why WTAR was special, we have to talk a little bit about how radio stations are judged. Radio stations are usually judged in 3 different categories: ratings, revenue, and prestige. Ratings, of course, is self-explanatory. That's the number of people that are listening at any given time, and rating services will be happy to do surveys to figure that out for a fee that is paid by radio stations and ad agencies alike. If you have a lot of people listening to your radio station, it's a safe bet that you're doing something that the public likes, and you have the potential to make a lot of revenue if you sell it properly. That doesn't necessarily mean just because you have good or high ratings that you are going to automatically make a bunch of money. I have worked for radio stations that had very good ratings, but for whatever reason didn't sell well. Agencies tend to be very fickle about what formats they buy, especially in the last 20 years or so. For instance, if you had a radio station that was doing an oldies format or a classic rock format, 20th century music basically, you might get really good ratings in your market, but the agencies might not buy you because there is a perception that with those kind of radio stations, the only people who listen are old people. It's not true. The ratings bear that out, but you can't fight the myth. Revenue comes from good ratings, and it can also come from prestige. Prestige is something that you can't buy. Prestige is something that only comes when you have a radio station that's been in a community for many, many years, serving that community well, and people recognize it immediately when you say the call letters or the name of the radio station, and they identify that radio station with something good, like reliable news, or great music, or entertaining personalities, whatever it is that makes that station great. And it's easy to sell a station like that even if you have lackluster ratings, because you can walk into a business and you can go, "Hi, I'm from," name of radio station. And the guy behind the counter says, "Oh yes, I know of them. They are great." And the person selling says, "Would you like to buy some airtime?" And the person behind the counter says, "Oh yes, please take my money. I must advertise on that station." That goes a long way, boys and girls. It really does. And if you have a radio station, like you purchase a station in a market that has a bad reputation for whatever reason, it is really difficult to get over that. WTAR had all of that and more. WTAR had the history, It had the clout. WTAR had the connections. It was the vital voice of Hampton Roads, the Norfolk market, for many, many, many years. WTAR formatically, starting in the 50s when they started to run less network programming and more local programming as the network programming moved to television, became a good music station. That's what they called it back then. And what that essentially meant was not rock and roll. It was people like Frank Sinatra and Perry Como and those sort of entertainers. Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin, Rat Pack stuff, and the Ray Conniff Singers, and lots of orchestras that were working and getting hits at that time. Perez Prado, for instance, all that kind of stuff. Well, that went into the 60s with people like Edie Gourmet and Nancy Wilson, and they played all this stuff. WTAR played that kind of music up until about 1974 when they modernized the format a little bit and they became an AC station, which is short for Adult Contemporary. Basically, that's whatever grown-up folks like to hear on the radio. They were always kind of shooting for your mom and dad. WGH might have beat them in the ratings, but WTAR, that was the radio station that you got in the car and your mom and dad were listening to. You know what I mean? In the early 80s, they switched to oldies, which would mean rock and roll oldies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even into the 80s. Their definition of oldies was, has it been off the charts for 2 years? We can play it. And so they did that throughout the 80s, and then in late 88 or early 89, they flipped the format again back to AC, which meant that they were playing more contemporary stuff, had a different jingle package, that sort of thing. And oddly enough, WLTY, which is what WTAR FM had morphed into, WLTY itself came on in 1981 as an adult contemporary station. They went to oldies when WTAR dropped the format. So they just flip-flopped the format from AM to FM. I don't know why. They just did that. And that was about the time that I went to work there. By the way, it was right after they had switched to the AC format. Great radio stations are more than music, and WTAR certainly was. WTAR fell into a category of station that was called full service. Now, your music could be different. A full service station could play top 40, you could play country, you could play AC, whatever. But the full service part meant that you had a real news department. That meant reporters that went out on the street and gathered news, and they actually broke news in the area, for instance. A real sports department would mean that you had enough people to go out and cover local sporting events, not only talk about them, but actually call play-by-play and put them on the air. WTAR certainly had that. WTAR had a traffic reporter that flew around in a helicopter for many years, and then they switched over to an airplane. WTAR had news vehicles that prowled the area looking for stories. WTAR had mobile studios that they could move around and broadcast from events. It was a really big radio station. Full-service radio was popular in the United States from the 50s up until the 90s. And usually every major town had at least one of these kind of stations that kind of did everything. There is a huge potential to make a lot of money with full-service radio because it appeals to a very wide audience. If they won't buy the music, then they'll buy the news. If they won't buy the news, then they'll buy the sports. If they won't buy the sports, they'll buy the talk show that you're running at night. If they won't buy the talk show, then they'll run the weekend oldies show that you're doing. You see what I mean? So you can make a lot of money with a station like that. However, it also requires a lot of people to make this happen, because you have to have your announcers and your news people, and then you have to have your sports people. Those are the guys you hear on the air. There are people working in the background all the time, right? You got engineers and board operators and writers and producers, not to mention the business office, not to mention the salespeople. This is a big operation. In 1989, when I went to work for WTAR, there were 30 people on staff, I counted, that were concerned with what went on the air. These were people that actually, at some point, sat down in front of a microphone and said something. We're not talking about 5 disc jockeys. This was a big operation, boys and girls, which unfortunately proved to be its downfall later on. But we'll talk about that later in the video. When WTAR switched over from oldies to AC, I actually started paying attention to it. That was my last year of school. And like I said, that was sometime around the first of the year that they did that, because it became interesting again. When they were oldies, they kind of got boring, at least for me, and I was into contemporary music too. Not that I don't like older music, I love it. But they had kind of got very predictable, and didn't listen that much, except hearing them around town in the car or whatnot. And when they switched over to a more contemporary format, it got interesting. Now, I had been listening to this radio station my entire life. Being a full-service station meant that one of the things that they did was report closings when we had inclement weather. And at school, they actually told us, listen to WTAR in the morning or in the evening before a day when it's supposed to snow to find out whether you're going to go to school. Because as soon as we make a decision, we will call them and they will tell you. So there were many late evenings and early mornings listening to WTAR, waiting to hear whether Portsmouth Public Schools were closed. In 1989 as well, talking about being more interested in the station, I had gotten to a place where I was really into these big heritage AMs, and I was doing a lot of listening to AM radio at night, taking advantage of the skip, listening to WOWO out of Fort Wayne, WLS out of Chicago, and these stations were all still doing interesting things on the air. This is before talk radio had completely taken over the AM band. Back when AM stereo was still a thing, and if you had an AM stereo radio, boy, it sounded good. And so I was really into that. And I was listening one night, and I tuned past WTAR, and there was a familiar voice there. It was John Corson. Now, John worked at WFOS. And when I was going to school there, he worked there for a while, and then he left, and I lost contact with him. And so I hear him again on WTAR, and I'm like, oh boy, let me call John up. Now, John was a neat guy. He was a little crazy. He loved classical music, which is one of the reasons that he was at WFOS. He had a history in fine arts public radio, so here I hear him on WTAR. So I had to call him up in the middle of the night and say, hi, and how are you doing? We got into a little conversation there. I said, yeah, we got to get together. He said, cool. He said, would you like to see the studios? I said, you bet I would. So about a couple of weeks later, John calls me up and said, hey, let's go out to lunch, and you can come hang with me. I got a ball game to do in the afternoon on WTAR. He said, I talked to my boss, and he said, it's cool. I said, well, thank you. I said, that's very cool. So we went and had lunch, and I went up there, and I hung out with John. And across the hall, a fellow named Dave Hale was working on WLTY. I went and introduced myself to Dave and hung out. We had a great time. I really enjoyed being there. And I think one of the last things I said to John before I left was, whose ass do I have to kiss to get a job here, man? Because I'd like to work in this building. It was really cool. There was a vibe in there that I really liked. And the building that WTAR was in at that time was a very special building all unto itself. This is a picture of the Broadcast Center from 1951. This is from a newspaper or a magazine article about it, a trade magazine. And this is shortly after the building was completed in 1950. Landmark Communications built this building because they put on a television station in Norfolk in 1950, WTAR TV 4 at that time. And so they built a special building to house the television and radio station. Now, this building was very influential on the networks when they were building their television studios. I found that out later. You see, I remember seeing pictures of CBS TV in the mid-50s and thinking, gosh, that looks a lot like WTAR. I guess when they built the WTAR building, they were modeling after the network. No, it was the other way around. The articles about this building were in a lot of magazines and influenced a lot of designers in the 50s. If you see the movie Good Night and Good Luck, which is about Edward R. Murrow at CBS TV in the 1950s when he was tackling Senator Joseph McCarthy during the McCarthy hearings. That's what the inside of this building looked like if you were in some of the older sections. The set designers for that movie, Good Night and Good Luck, absolutely nailed it. Here's what Master Control looked like at WTAR in 1951. This is for radio. Where this guy is sitting, on either side of him, he has two massive studios big enough to fit entire orchestras, or to conduct a radio drama, or have a big panel discussion in. And in front of him, there's one room that's called the recording room, and the other room is called the announcer's booth. Now, you can't really see them here, but they're there. And those rooms would later become the AM and FM studios when I was there in 1989, and the big studios were cut up. The one to this person's right became the newsroom, and the one to this person's left became a couple of production studios plus an announcer's lounge. Dale Parsons, by the way, who was the operations manager at WTAR, he was there from the late 70s to the early 80s, is one of the few people that has actually kept up with the changes through the years, and he kind of gave me a whole bunch of stuff about that he had put together, and at some point I'm going to do a video about this because it's actually quite fascinating, but we won't get into that today, the changes through the years. So that's the way it looked in 1951, and if you fast forward to about 1991, this is one of the studios there. This is not the AM studio, this was a production studio, and there I am sitting in the chair. After visiting with John, I did call Bob Reidel to inquire about maybe some employment, and he said, well, what are you doing now? I said, well, I'm in school, and he said, make sure that you send me something before you graduate. He said, I'm going to have something coming up. I said, that's awesome. Because I was trying to look for a job after school anyway. I wanted something to do, and I wanted something that was close to home, and WTAR fit the bill. In those days, it was real easy in my neighborhood in Portsmouth to hop into the Midtown Tunnel and go across the Elizabeth River, and bam, you were in downtown Norfolk, and you took a left down Brambleton Avenue, and you went down for a little ways, and there you were at Bush Street. And WTAR was right there almost on the corner of Bush and Brambleton. 720 Bush Street is the address. By the way, there's still a television station there, and that building is also used for broadcasting a lot of stuff to other television stations. The television station itself was sold in 1981. The FCC came along and told Landmark Communications, we don't like it that you own a newspaper and two radio stations and a television station in the same market, so you have to sell one. They decided to sell the TV station, and they sold it to a company called Knight Ridder. And when they did, the only real change was they changed the call letters of the television station from WTAR-TV to WTKR-TV. Literally, that's all it changed. Anyway, I was happy to talk to Bob. I had put my resume together in a tape, and I sent it in to him. And at just about the end of May, he called me up, and he said, come on in, I want to talk to you. I said, cool. So I go over to the radio station, and I'm all dressed up, ready to go. I have my stuff together. I got my tie. I've got a copy of my resume just in case he wants another one. You know, I'm all prepared. I have been rehearsing what I'm going to say. This is my first real big job interview. I go in the building, tell the lady at the front desk I have an appointment. She lets me upstairs. I tell the receptionist at the radio station, hey, I got an appointment with Bob. They let me in, and, you know, I go sit down in the lobby. I'm like, this is cool. And here comes Bob walking up in a green polo shirt and blue jeans. I'm wearing a coat and a tie. I thought, oh, I've overdressed. So he led me back to his office. We go back there, sit down. I'm thinking he's going to start asking questions. No. He opens his desk drawer. He pulls out some papers and he hands them to me. He says, fill these out. At first I thought it was an application. I looked at it. It wasn't. It was tax forms, like the kind you fill out when you get a job. And I looked at him and I said, does this mean you're hiring me? He said, yeah. He said, it'll be a little while before I put you on the schedule. I want to wait for you to graduate, and I got some changes coming up anyway. I said, cool. So I filled out the paperwork, gave it back to him, shook his hand. He gave me the nickel tour, which I really didn't need because I'd already been to the radio station. He knew that, by the way. And then, but basically, he went around and introduced me to people. It wasn't seeing studios and stuff. I'd already seen the studios, and he knew that. So graduation came, and it went. And between the time that I saw Bob and graduation, I had to go over and pee in a cup because at that time to work for Landmark Communications, the Virginian Pilot and Ledger Star newspaper in Norfolk, and WTAR and WLTY radio, you had to take a drug test. They wanted to make sure I wasn't too drugged up to be on the radio. I passed. I never did do drugs. So I'm waiting for this phone call, and I'm like, man, come on, I'm ready to go to work now. I graduated school. Call me up. So I got a phone call. Bob calls me up, and he says, are you out of school? And I said, yes. And he said, cool. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to come in and hang out with Dan O'Brien in the evening, and he will teach you how to run the board and show you how everything in the studio works. Cool. So I went up to the radio station. I hung out with Dan O'Brien, and that was a very cool evening because I went in there, and Dan was somebody that I was anxious to meet because I had listened to him all my life. He had been on WNOR when I was a little kid, and then later went to WGH. He was there for about 9 years, and then he ended up doing evenings on WTAR. Super nice guy. And his other job at WTAR was music dubber. He was in charge of taking all of the music and putting it onto cartridge to play on the air, which is a job that I'm actually doing today, but I'm not dubbing cartridges. I am preparing audio files for broadcast. Exactly the same job, though. He wasn't the music director per se, but he was taking care of the library because that's a very smart thing to do. You don't want a bunch of people doing that job. You want one person to do it, so it's all very consistent. Anyway, when I went in the studio, it was very pleasant to meet him. He's a very nice guy. I ended up working with Dan again about 10 years later, so we always had a very good rapport. And for that particular evening, he just got up and walked around the counter there and sat down in front of the guest microphone, and he said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to play DJ, and you're going to push the buttons so you can figure the board out. I said, that's fine. I sat down, and so I would turn on his microphone when he would give me the signal, and I would play the song that he wanted me to play or the commercials or whatever. And we did this for about 45 minutes, and he turned around and he said, you're good at this. You know what you're doing. You have caught on quicker than anybody that I have ever trained at this radio station. And I said, well, thank you. See, what he didn't know is that I'd already gone up there and hung out with John and kind of peeked over his shoulder and pushed a button here and there. So I was already pretty familiar, but I took the compliment, you know. So that went very well, and then I went back home, and I waited for the phone to ring, and I was waiting, and it just seemed to never ring. And really, honestly, probably only about 2 weeks went by, and I was just getting ready to call up and go, man, do I work here or what? I don't understand. I want to make some money. And about then, it was July the 4th, and I got a phone call in the morning on July the 4th from Bob Riedel. He actually left a message on the answering machine, which I have a recording of. And if you want to hear it, go to the description of this video and click on the video that says WTAR Memories. It's the first thing you hear. And Bob said that he had Mr. John Corson in front of him, and he was looking at schedule changes and options. Could I please call him back? Well, I did. And it turns out that they needed somebody to cover overnight on WTAR because the regular overnight guy, Andy Tompkins, was not going to be there. Apparently, the overnight people on July the 4th just had too much fun because neither of them showed up. John Corson was going to be on WLTY, and I was going to be on WTAR, so we rode in to work together. This was going to be fun. My first night on the air that I got paid for it. Now, if you want to hear what the first break sounds like, you can also listen to that WTAR Memories video, and you can hear the shakiness in my voice because I'm telling you, I was nervous. I was pretty confident about pushing the buttons, but it was just the whole experience of being on this very powerful AM radio station that I knew could be heard at night from Nova Scotia to the Florida Keys. WTAR is an old lady. She is a grand old lady of radio. And the 790 frequency she was on was sort of grandfathered in. Now, in the books it says it's 5,000 watts, and it is at the base current if you measure it. However, they have an active antenna system, a critical array, which essentially takes that 5,000 watts and beams it north and south, so you get an effective radiated power to the south of the station at the North Carolina line of about 45,000 watts. And so therefore, it didn't get out to the west very well because we were protecting a radio station in Allentown, Pennsylvania on 790, plus WAKY in Louisville, Kentucky. But to the north and south, we blasted. And so you knew people were listening any time of the day. Or at least I found out they were listening. We'll talk about that in a few. So I went in and did this overnight show, and I made a few boo-boos, but I thought it went off pretty well, and my brother had taped the thing, so I was pretty confident that, there wasn't going to be any flack from it. What I didn't know when I went in there was that what I was doing was actually an audition. You see, Bob Riedel, and I only found this out years later, the way he worked is that he would go ahead and hire people, and if he didn't like you, he'd just fire you. So fortunately, I passed muster, because a couple of days later, I got a phone call, and he wanted to talk about putting me on the schedule in a permanent position. I was like, oh, this is very cool. So my first job at WTAR permanently was to go in on Sunday mornings at 5 o'clock and do this block of programming. At 5 o'clock, you would do CBS News, and after that, you would play records for about 24 minutes, and then you would go into a show called Hampton Roads Sunday, which was produced by the news department, and then after that, it was blocks of, for about 2 or 3 hours there, of half-hour shows that came in on tape, and at that time, we were still playing things off of records, too, so you'd have to have the turntable hooked up. And that was it. And I remember I went in to find out about that, and Bruce Garraway, who was doing middays at WTAR at that time, he said, "Are you going to be doing this Sunday morning thing?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Bring a book. I've done it." I said, "Okay." It was a snooze fest, that was for sure. But as time went on, it got interesting. And it got interesting because they also asked me to do 6 to midnight on Saturday, where I would run the board for the Solid Gold Saturday Night Show, which came out of New York. The host's name was Bob Worthington for that show. If Solid Gold Saturday Night was going to be preempted by a ball game of some sort, then I would run that if necessary. At midnight, somebody came in and spelled me until 5 o'clock, at which point I went back on the air and worked from 5 to 10. What I would ordinarily do in that situation would be either order pizza or bring dinner, have dinner at the station. At midnight, I'd get off the air, go downstairs. They had a lounge, and I would watch TV or sleep on the couch a little bit and have somebody come down and wake me up so I could go back on the air Sunday morning. We did a lot of that on the weekends because I remember John Corson worked across the hall pushing the buttons on the FM, and then he sometimes would come and do the overnight on the AM. And then I would go to sleep, and somebody else would come in to do FM, and we were just kind of walking back and forth from studio to studio. At that point, I wasn't on WLTY. They didn't trust me enough, I guess. A couple of things that happened on that Sunday morning. One morning, I fell asleep when I was doing all of this, being in the radio station for, what was that? It was more than 12 hours. It was 6 to 6 a.m. and then to 10, so yeah. I can't do the math right now, 16 hours that I was actually in the station. And so one Sunday morning I fell asleep, and I was awoke by the sound of the tape recorder going kerchunk, which meant that it had run out of tape. Now, I don't know how much blank tape there was from the end of the program that was playing to the end of the tape when it spooled off the reel, but that woke me up and I ended up pushing a button. And then another thing that happened on that Sunday morning show was one Sunday I just perchance started the wrong tape recorder and I got a couple of those shows out of order. It was like whatever was supposed to play at 8 o'clock played at 8:30, and I thought, well, I'll play the 8:30 since I'm playing the 8 o'clock show. Or I got them reversed. It was whatever was supposed to play at 8:30 played at 8 o'clock, and then the 8 o'clock show I had to wait till 8:30. That makes more sense, yes. And I was writing it down on the log that I made this mistake. Honestly, at that point, I didn't figure anybody would care. Most of these shows were public service of some sort. They weren't paid for. The phone started ringing. I got about 10 phone calls in a row from people asking what happened to whatever the name of the show was, In the Public Interest or whatever it was. And I said, well, I've started I told them, explained to them, I got it out of order. And they were like, okay. Or one person was mad. They were like, well, I'm not going to be able to listen at 8:30. I've got places to go, and I'm used to hearing this. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, people listen to this stuff. With a radio station with that much power, yes, they do. So the next morning, I called Bob up at like 10 o'clock, and I said, hey, I'm calling you before somebody else does to let you know that I flip-flopped one of them shows yesterday morning with another. And he said, the phones rang, didn't they? I didn't even have to say anything. I said, yeah, they did. He said, people are listening. I said, I was surprised. And he said, well, pay attention. And hung up the phone. Another thing that happened during that first period that I was at WTAR, playing the AC music and doing the Sundays and the Saturdays, was I was doing an awful lot of fill-in work. And one night I was there. They had switched it from me being there Saturday night and pushing the buttons for Bob Worthington. They had a fellow that came in by the name of Dave Barrett. And Dave started doing that part, and then I would come in at midnight and stay until 10 in the morning. I remember doing that a lot. Or just working till 5, from midnight to 5, and then somebody else would take over. In other words, it wasn't like they were working me to death all the time. It was just occasionally that I would work a long shift. I don't want to make them sound like slave masters. But I was young and able and didn't care anyway. I mean, I usually accepted a lot of that stuff. Oh, no, I'll just work through. I'm all right, you know. But this one particular night that I was doing that Saturday into Sunday, there was a riot in Virginia Beach. This would have been Greek Fest of 1990. I don't remember the date, but you could look it up if you wanted to. And I started to get these phone calls from people going, hey, what's going on down here? There's all kinds of crazy stuff happening, and there's cops, and I hear a lot of noise, and we didn't know at the radio station. We were like, I don't know, and it's the middle of the night. What do you do? And this was the one time of the week when there wasn't somebody in the news department. I think the only time that we didn't have somebody actually in the newsroom was Saturday afternoon till about midday on Sunday. So it would have been about 5 or 6 in the afternoon on Saturday till midday Sunday. There was nobody in the newsroom. And so I tried to call the news director. She didn't answer the phone. I was trying to get somebody. So fortunately, what I did at that point was to start calling downtown. Just grabbed a phone book and called 411, got the numbers and called the police department. And I started to piece together what was going on. And I had all these unconfirmed reports of rioting in Virginia Beach related to this thing they had going on called Greek Fest. And so I was still trying to get somebody from the news department to come in when the hotline rang in the studio, and I answered it, and it was CBS in New York. And a guy identified himself as a producer at CBS, and he says, we're getting some strange reports up here of something happening in Virginia Beach. Do you have any information on it? And so I said, well, yeah, I've got a little bit. Some of it's unconfirmed. I told him what I had. He said, can you give me 30 seconds on that right now? And I said, what do you mean? He said, just tell me what you just told me, and ended up with Joe Collins, WTAR for CBS News. So I ended up doing an impromptu report on Greek Fest in 1990 that was fed to CBS. Apparently, the news director that I was trying to reach heard this, and they weren't very happy about it because nobody was there. And I remember getting scolded. She finally did show up, or somebody in the news department showed up, and they were like, well, if something like this happens, you need to call people. I'm like, I called everybody I could think of. Nobody would answer the phone. I don't think they were very happy that Mr. Green Kid got on the network. I don't know why, but that's just how I remember it. This is a picture of me in the production studio at WTAR. The two on the left are in one of the production rooms that I'm fooling around. The one on top is another production room other than the last picture that you saw. And the one at the bottom is me ogling the cassette deck there, probably trying to figure out how much tape is left. That was behind my head in the last picture. Upper right is my friend George Johnson, who used the name George Lewis on the air. And George was hanging out with me this particular night, and I took a picture of him there. George ended up working at WTAR along with me for some period of time. And the lower right-hand picture is of WMXN radio, and that is an entirely different video that we will talk about later. In a later video, not later in this video, but I will tell you that at one point in time I got mad and quit WTAR and went to work for another company, and that was the studio I worked in, showing my friend Mike Carey in there. He was working there as well. Here's George in the main studio at WTAR. This is the only picture that I have of the main studio during that period of time, and it is a really bad one. You'll notice that there's a computer monitor up front. That is a Unix system. My first introduction to Unix-like computing was at this station. They had a mini frame with terminals all over the building, and there's one of them right there. As you can see, it was a rather small room because they had decided, for whatever reason, that they were going to stuff the FM and AM studios in these former little recording rooms and whatever. This is where they were. And so I kind of liked it, though. It was like working in a submarine, no windows. And the building itself was so stoutly constructed and so soundproof that you could have a monster thunderstorm going on outside. You never knew it. As a matter of fact, the first thing that anybody would ask if you showed up when you came in from outside is, what's the weather like outside? Because they didn't know. This is a great picture for this next part of the story because it's essentially an empty studio. Well, I'm sitting there, but it's just a board. And this picture is also from that series of pictures I got from George not too long ago. About 10 years ago, I got those pictures. I used to have a ton of pictures of WTAR. At this time, I was also very much into photography, and I took a lot of pictures, but I got lost in a move, and it's very, very sad because I had lots of pictures of the people that I worked with there, and I would love to show them to you, but they have gotten lost. January the 3rd, 1990 was a very bad day at WTAR. That was the day that the top brass from Landmark Communications came in and fired a whole lot of people. They had decided that they could make more money if they took WTAR and turned it into a satellite syndication type station. There was a satellite network called Transtar that offered a 24-hour format called Original Hits from the Original Stars. Sort of like the music of your life. That was another one. I called that the music of your death. So at that point in time, Andy Tompkins, who had been doing overnights on the station for 20 years, and Jim Lawrence, who had been the midday person there for 17 years and the production director, they were fired. And there was a big shuffle. Tom Looney moved from mornings to afternoons. Half the news department got the axe. It was really a sad day. I didn't get fired, but they essentially kind of eliminated my job at that point, which sounds strange but true, because they had this satellite network that they could throw on the air, and those disc jockeys could talk. They really didn't need somebody to do swing work, and so I was there just running a board a lot of the time and dropping commercials into this network afterwards. It was boring, and to be quite honest, I found it to be a bit insulting. At this point in time, I wasn't offered anything on the FM side. They didn't seem very interested in letting me cross the hall, and they had cut my pay from $7.50 to $5.50. And I was there for about 3 months after they switched this format, got tired of it, and got another job. I ended up working for that radio station for about 6-7 months, and then I actually came back to WTAR. I came back in October of 1990, and by then they had loosened up a little bit. I think they had found a little bit more money, and also one of the reasons that I came back was because they had said that there would be an opportunity to also do things on the FM side, which is really what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an announcer. I don't mind running a board, and I actually enjoy running network things, but don't cut me off completely from it. You know what I mean? So I came back to work, and all was well once again, and I ended up doing a lot of things on WTAR and on WLTY for the next few years. I stopped working at WTAR when they changed the format from Music of Your Death to all news. Before I get to telling you about that, this is an interesting picture. It's a Polaroid, obviously. Behind me are 4 ITC Series 99B cart machines. Now, those cart machines, and they're all recorders, are from the mid-'80s, and at that time they cost $6,000 a piece. So behind my punky head right there, that, ladies and gentlemen, is $24,000 1980s money worth of tape recorders. And they had another 3 in the production studio and a couple in the newsroom. So they had a lot of cart machines around that building. One of the reasons I like it. I love cart machines. And I said that in a former video, and people say, well, they're all taken over by computers now. I said, yeah, I know that. I'm like, sure, you know. Like I said, I'm actually doing music library stuff for the radio station I work for now, and that's just uploading a lot of files. There's no physical anything involved, but I still love carts, man. I thought they were cool then, and I think they're cool now. WTAR went all news. When the Music of Your Death format didn't work out, they decided that it was time to play the last card that they had in their hand that they thought they could make some money with, and that was to ride on the news reputation of WTAR. They hired a fellow named Tom Crimseer to take over programming the station. And I remember having a big meeting one day in which we all sat around. These were people that were working in the WTAR department. And we were in the big conference room. And it was one of those things where they try to make it sound like that you yourself are making the decision to go with this new scheme, see? And I wasn't buying it from the beginning because I knew that if they were going to do anything other than do this all news thing, they wouldn't have hired this guy who had a history of consulting news stations. After the meeting, I went to the general manager's office and knocked on the door, sat down, asked Ron Rieger, could I please no longer be associated with WTAR? I would like to work with WLTY exclusively. You see, they were 2 different departments within the company. And at that time, I was working for 2 departments simultaneously. So I asked to be transferred full-time to one department and stop working for the other. And believe it or not, they didn't fire me on the spot because of my audacity, and if they did, I would have been okay with it. But they didn't, and they said, yes, you can continue to work here for WLTY, so I did. The all-news format didn't do anything. They broadcast CNN headline news most of the time when they didn't have a live person on the air. And so it was a CNN-affiliated station, and they had CBS at the top of the hour, and they had dual affiliations, which meant a lot of network news. But I do know that they had Dan O'Brien was still there, and Tom Looney was still doing afternoons, just doing news-related things. The all-news format lasted for a little while under Tom Crimseer, and then they actually made a pretty good decision, and that was they hired a fellow named Pat Murphy. We'll talk about Pat in just a moment. This picture right here shows part of the control area in the engineering room for WTAR. And the rack all the way in the middle there has the audio chain for WTAR. If you look very closely, you'll see some CRL audio processors there. You'll also see that big patch bay, and there's a microtrack distribution amp there. Up top, there's an Orban Blue, the blue box. That would be a reverb unit that was used back when they were oldies. And above that is a Harris Audio Time Bass Corrector, which is a very interesting device. What it did was, in the production room, when you would record a tape to be played back on the air at WTAR, there was a 19 kilohertz pilot tone that was injected. And this tone carried a time signal that the box in the rack there could decode. Now, being at 19 kilohertz, you couldn't hear it on the air. Most people can't hear 19 kilohertz anyway. That's almost above the range of human hearing. You'd have to be a kid with really good ears to be able to hear that anyway. This machine would decode that, and if there were any abnormalities like a phase shift between the right and left channel, or maybe even some flutter arising from a tape that's kind of getting caught, or a cyclical flutter from a capstan that wasn't perfectly round, this could correct for it. It actually worked quite well. And it was installed on WTAR because being a stereo radio station on AM, it was figured that only about 10% of the people out there actually had stereo radios, and the mono signal therefore was very important. And so this would cause phase error that can cause funky sounds when tape gets wonky, it's not aligned properly, and it can cancel out high frequencies. So let's talk about Pat. Pat Murphy was a star in the Hampton Roads radio market, and he worked at WNIS radio for years. And he was the program director at WNIS, and at one point in time during my career at WTAR, I think it was back after they had changed the format, I got mad and went over to WNIS and had a job interview with Pat Murphy and Ken Johnson over there, and they hired me. And I never showed up for the job. I just begged off at the last minute and said, no, I'd rather not. I'm going to stay where I am. So the people at Landmark got pretty smart, and they hired Pat, and they brought him in to run WTAR. And Pat really injected a lot of life into it. Now, this is a talk station, but he stopped the all-news thing. It was going to become a news talk station now. And Pat did a fun show. It was really worth listening to. He was doing the mornings, and he kind of opened things up for Tom and Dan and the other people that were there, so it was a more loosey-goosey kind of sound. And he hired a fella named Mike Rowell overnight to do sort of a kind of a Art Bell sort of show before that was a popular thing. And so it was a pretty cool radio station. Unfortunately, it was too little too late, and it didn't save WTAR from being sold. But the funny part is that when they bought Pat, when they brought him in, I knew he was coming, and I remembered that I had been hired and never showed up, so I was a little nervous about that. So here comes Pat Murphy one morning wandering in about 4:30. Now I'm walking across the hall from the FM station where I was working all night, and I run into Pat. And he said, "Hi." And I said, "Hi to you too." And I said, "Do you remember me?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry I didn't come to work." He said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, don't you remember you hired me and I never showed up?" He said, "I did?" I said, "I remember you hanging around the station a lot because I used to hang out at WNIS with my friends an awful lot when Pat Murphy was there. He knew me by sight. But he had forgotten that he had hired me and I never showed up. So I said, "Oops, that never happened. We didn't have this conversation. Would you like some coffee?" It was kind of like one of those things. Pat was really fun to work with when he was at WTAR, and he tried mighty hard. And Pat was just really a good guy in radio that I ended up working with in different capacities through the years. Super nice guy. This is the slow logger in this picture. This lovely device was a tape system that recorded WTAR and WLTY 24 hours a day. There were 4 tracks on each of these tapes, 10-inch reels, running at 15/16 IPS. This gives you 24 hours of tape in a day. And so, therefore, everything that went on the air was actually recorded and saved for a month, because we had 31 tapes which we would rotate. The slow logger through the years got people fired because if you accidentally said a curse word on the air, it would be caught here and management could hear it. And if you missed a commercial, for instance, and a client complained, well, this is where they would go to double check to see what happened at that particular point in time. Like I said, there were 4 tracks. One of them was WTAR, one of them was WLTY, another was time code that you could use to just punch in the time and the machine would go find it. And the other track, the available track, was usually used to record whatever management would like to monitor in the market. Like at one point in time, I know that we were recording 2WD 24 hours a day, which is WWDE in Hampton, a radio station that's still on the air to this day. For whatever reason, they wanted to hear what they were doing. When I worked evenings at WTAR and WLTY, one of my jobs was to tend to this lovely piece of machinery. And I would have to switch the tapes and set it up for the next day, because what it would do is if, for instance, you were recording on the top machine, the bottom machine would be ready to go, and at midnight, when it switched over, it would switch tapes. And there was always an overlap because there was a little bit of tape left on one reel, so they never missed anything, see? Now, I know for a fact a couple of times through the years that I worked there that, a couple of these reels got erased for various reasons. And no, I don't have a clue how that happened or why somebody would be erasing the slow logger reel. I just don't know. Yeah. Here's a turntable in the production room at WTAR. It's a Technics SL1200, and the cartridge that's on there is a Shure V15 Type 4 that was used to put records onto tape to put on the air at WTAR. It gave WTAR a lovely sound on the air. I can listen to the old air checks even to this day and hear the warm sound of that Shure cartridge. I worked at WTAR and WLTY for just about 4 years, as I said in the beginning of the video. There was a 6 or 7 month period where I was working somewhere else, but I did come back. And it was generally a very positive experience. Landmark Communications decided that they were going to sell their radio stations. Ron Rieger, who was the general manager at WTAR and WLTY, where I was working, tried to get them to buy more radio stations. This company owned a bunch of newspapers and a bunch of television stations, but being that WTAR was the beginning of Landmark Communications, this was the only radio station they owned. And I was told through the years that Frank Batten Sr., who was the head of the company, he was very fond of the radio stations, and when it would come up in board meetings that they weren't making as much money, let's say, as the other members of the corporation would be happy with, he would just move on and dismiss it. As the CEO of the company, he just didn't want to have anything to do with it. Frank Batten was a super nice man, and he would come and visit the radio stations. There really wasn't much going on between the newspaper and the radio stations. The newspaper building was directly behind the radio stations, and at night when I would show up at work to go to on the air, let's say at 11:30, as you went into the building, you would hear the printing presses running, pressing the morning edition. And but we didn't really have much interplay back and forth. But every now and again, this well-dressed man with white hair and a voice box, he had apparently had to have his voice box removed at some point for throat cancer, would be walking around the building. And I remember meeting him on several occasions. He was very kind, and he would say, "How are you doing?" You know, that sort of thing. He was the owner of the whole shebang. But Frank retired, and his son took over. And when he did, he kind of poo-pooed all of Dad's sentimentality over these two little radio stations. And one of the first things that happened as they worked their way up to putting the stations on the block was that they fired Tom Looney. Tom had started at the station in 1967, and he was one of the announcers there that I looked up to, probably the one I looked up to the most, because he had just always been there. And while I was there, he was this vision of professionalism. You could learn from Tom just listening to him on the air, but watching him in the studio was another thing. He was just so quiet and calm and deliberate. It really looked like that Tom was more at home in a radio studio than anywhere else. And one of the saddest things that I have ever seen in my entire radio career, and I've seen some unpleasant things, was the fact that Landmark Communications fired Tom Looney about 6 or 8 months before he was eligible for retirement. They just put him in the street. The last time that I saw Tom, he was in the building putting together a demo tape so he could go find himself a job. I stopped him in the hallway before he left, and I told him, I said, it has really been a privilege to work with you all these years, and that I appreciated him being so nice to me even though I was a green kid. And I told him that I especially will always remember him for all of those lovely snow days when I didn't have to go to school because I was listening to him. He probably thought I was crazy when I told him that, but Tom smiled, and he said, "We'll talk again." He turned around and walked out the door. That was the last time that I talked to Tom Looney. Tom called my mother about a year later after I had left WTAR, and I was working actually at a radio station across the state, and wanted to know if I had any tape of him on the air, which I did, and unfortunately never got to Tom. There was one tape that I was looking for in particular that stayed lost for many, many years, and I only found it about 10 years ago. I have posted a skim of that recording on YouTube, and there's a link to it. So if you go listen to Tom Looney in 1991, which is in the description to this video, you will hear how much of a professional he was. And not only that, he was doing his own news this particular weekend. I guess the news department had the weekend off, or this was something that they had cut trying to save some money. And Tom is just absolutely wonderful in every category there. My own personal time at WTAR and WLTY ended shortly after the radio stations were sold to a company called Benchmark. And on WLTY, they kept it oldies, but they tweaked up the format and did some interesting things. I was part-time swing there for most of the time, but toward the very end, I worked full-time overnights and on the WLTY, and just hated it, to be quite honest. I was overdoing the all-night thing at that point. I was married and I had a very small child, and I wanted to do something else. And so I found an opportunity to move on to Roanoke in Virginia, and that's a story for another day. But I certainly have never forgotten my time working at WTAR and WLTY. It was a truly magical place, and kind of like the WFOS dream that I talked about with Jamie Dillinger that I had not too long ago. I have dreamed of being in that studio on the air on WTAR at night ever since then. It's always the same dream. I'm there and something's wrong. I don't have a log, or I can't find any music to play, or somebody's stolen all the commercials and I'm trying to figure out what to do on the air. But I'm sure that it's just because I spent so much time there, nearly 4 years. It's almost the longest that I worked at any radio station. The only other radio station that I worked longer is the one that I'm working at now. In total, I've worked at that radio station now for about 6-7 years, maybe even 8. I have to do the math. But that's for a later video, boys and girls. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate it. I've had so many positive comments on this series of videos, and there's going to be a lot more to come. We'll talk to you again soon.